Jake, we have to start.
I will naturally prompt them.
We're going to. We will focus in this next session on what's happening in America, refugees and immigration in the Trump era. In the last session, we will get to some of those root causes that Katie Fleming was talking about at the end of the first panel. But without delay, let me introduce people. Mickey Kaus, author of the Kaus Files, longtime friend of mine with whom I almost always disagree. He's been a political blogger since 1999, was a major force at Newsweek magazine when Newsweek was a major presence in America. Ali Noorani, the executive director of the National Immigration Forum, previously the executive director of the Massachusetts Immigrant and Refugee Advocacy Coalition, and a lifetime member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Manuel Pasteur, director of the Center for the Study of Immigration and Integration at USC, professor of sociology and American studies and ethnicity, and director of the USC Program for Environmental and Regional Equity. Joel Benenson, pollster, founder and CEO of the Benenson Strategy Group. He was the chief pollster and senior strategist for Barack Obama in 2008 and 2012. Worked on President Clinton's polling team in 1996 and was a strategist for Hillary Clinton in 2016. So I'm going to start by asking Joel a question all the way down at the end of the table. Joel, what role did the immigration issue play in the election of Donald Trump?
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for having us. Happy to be here always in Southern California, particularly before it's really spring back in New York. Look, there's no polling or data that I've seen during the campaign or post-election that suggests that immigration was actually a top voting issue on its own, either nationally or in the battleground states that really mattered to us. What I think Donald Trump did during the campaign was to explicitly link immigration to crime and terrorism issues in a way that agitated and animated the racist anxieties and fears of a subset of his base in the Republican Party. And I say that after looking at data in the exit polls as well, where if you look at just 6 or 7 battleground states, there was a question in the exit polls this year that was very interesting that said, I've never seen it in the exit polls before, based on how things work in America today, do you think whites are favored, minorities are favored, or neither is favored? And in the 6 or 7 battleground states that were really critical to our calculus, between 16 and 31% of voters said that minorities were favored. And I think objectively it is really impossible to see how people could make that statement without having some racist anxieties or fears in their decision-making frame. What's notable about that group of people is that Trump's plurality of votes among those voters is significantly larger. It ranged of a ratio of between 4-to-1 and 10-to-1 in those 6 states. So he was winning those voters by a bigger plurality than voters who had just said that immigration was the #1 issue. So they were more troubled by their racial anxieties and fears, and Trump was stoking them, than they were about the immigration itself. And if you couple that with data that goes back to the George Bush era, which we'll probably get into at some point, when comprehensive immigration reform was proposed, there has never been anything but a strong majority of support for the comprehensive immigration reform that George Bush proposed, which included a path to citizenship and what we've now come to know as the DREAM Act.
Mickey, you have some very strong pro-Trump feelings, at least on this issue. How do you react to what Joel said?
There's sort of a contradiction between saying immigration wasn't an issue, yet they were all racist. It seems to me clearly there was something that moved these white voters who had been absent from the previous couple of elections to turn out in greater numbers. And I don't have poetry, but I have a chart. And the chart is showing...
They can't hear you without the mic.
Yeah, the chart is showing what happened to hourly wages for on various skill levels from 73 to 2003, but the trend continues, which is people with skills, college degrees, advance, and people with less than high school degrees actually decline. They go down. That's not supposed to happen in our society. And this is a very good reason why people might have been aggrieved, because part of this decline comes from competition from unskilled immigrants. And people might say, without any racist feelings, our citizens should have good wages, and we don't need to have all these people coming in and bidding down our wages. And that is a non-racist reason why people might have voted for Trump.
Can I just get a quick point in, just to
Sure.
throw another piece
Sure,
of
then I
data?
want to throw
Yeah,
this to Manuel
please.
and Ali.
If that were the case, Mickey, I think that when Pew does its political typology and asks whether immigrants today are a burden to the U.S. by taking jobs, housing, and health care, or strengthen the U.S. with hard work and talents, and by 65 to 25, they say immigrants strengthen the U.S. with their hard work and talents, including almost half of Republicans. I think there's something else at work here than wages and housing and jobs when people vote in large numbers based on a racial perception, a larger perception based on a racial perception that minorities are favored, than a statistic that doesn't say anything about how those people voted.
You have affirmative action programs that explicitly favor minorities. Why is it crazy to say minorities are favored?
Well, Donald Trump went to Flint, Michigan. We could have a political debate that rehashes the campaign, but don't take my word for it. Donald Trump went to Flint, Michigan during the campaign, if you recall, and stood up in front of a largely African-American audience, and he said, African-Americans today have nothing today. You have no jobs. You have no schools. You have no future. That was his message. I don't think he was saying that minorities were favored at that moment in time.
Well, let me pull this back to immigration and start with Ali and then go to Manuel. The Trump argument is that immigrants take American jobs and that they're responsible for a disproportionate share of crime. I think we're already into a lively discussion, and I think if we keep going down this road, it will get livelier. But could you respond to that?
Sure. So we think that the American public struggles with the question of immigration through three core anxieties. Those core anxieties are culture, security, and economy. And we really trying to distill this down to three questions. Culturally speaking, are immigrants integrating or are they isolating? Are they, in essence, becoming Americans or remaining immigrants? From a security perspective, are they threats to our safety or are they protectors of our safety? And then finally, from an economic perspective, and I think this is both in terms of jobs but also access to programs, the question that people struggle with is, are immigrants giving or taking? So for us as an organization, we spend 80% of our time in the Southeast, the Midwest, and the Mountain West, the communities that are struggling with this in the most difficult way, in the most emotional way. So for us, how do we provide the frameworks that are based on our individuals' values and their communities' values so that they can answer those questions, so that ultimately they reach a place where they come to believe that immigrants are protecting our country as members of the armed forces, as members of the local police, as individuals who are reporting crimes, who are giving back to the American economy as job creators, as people who are using less programs and services than others, and ultimately becoming Americans. And it's, we've already kind of launched into the debate about polling. I think political polling is based on a really, really soft foundation when it comes to this issue. Because as soon as whether it's a Donald Trump or anybody else starts to poke and prod at those three core anxieties, that support crumbles. I mean, Joel's absolutely right. The numbers have always been 60, 70, 80% in support of immigration reform. But it's a soft foundation. So we've got to figure out how do we engage people so that ultimately they believe that their kids are going to do better than them because of immigrants and immigration.
Manuel?
Well, I feel a little culturally deprived here because I don't have a Greek poem to start with, so let's just have that settled. I mean, one of the challenging things in this conversation is that I'm an economist, and so facts matter. And showing a chart showing wages going in downward for low-skilled workers blaming that on immigration without talking about globalization and technological change, which are actually the main drivers of that, is pretty misleading. The most conservative estimate by George Borjas from Harvard University, who's sort of restrictionist in his point of view, he believes that, most economists think that what immigrants do is actually add to the macroeconomy. The issue is really about distributional effects, because when you add workers, add consumers, that's going to grow the economy. The question is, what's the impact on workers who are already in the economy? Turns out, for high-skilled workers, it's probably a good thing because it adds complementary low-skill work. And what Borjas, who has the most conservative estimate on this, believes, with some adjustments, is that over the course of 20 years, the mass inflow of immigrants has resulted in a 3 percentage point decline in real wages for people with less than a high school degree. Let me repeat that. 3% decline over 20 years for people with less than a high school degree. That means you could repair a century of damage with a $1 increase in the minimum wage. So it's a very, very small impact that we're talking about, and it's one that's enormously misleading. If you think, though, and look at the pattern of the election, what's pretty interesting is the people that seem to have been the most nervous about immigrants don't have any immigrants, right? So it's not as though there's a bunch of Mexican immigrants bum-rushing West Virginia to go work in coal mines. Hazleton, which was sort of nervous about immigrants, is now quite welcoming. This is in the middle of Pennsylvania because they've helped to revitalize their downtowns. It's clear that what was driving this election was anxiety about the demographic shift in the United States. That, I think, is really fundamental. And the places that have the most immigrants, places like California, have realized, by the way, in the 1980s, half of all new immigrants coming into the country came into California. So we really experienced that immigrant shock. And in the early 1990s, we then had our own little freak out with Prop 187. And the way I think about this is that the United States just went through its Prop 187 moment, sort of freak out about undocumented immigrants, economic decline, which was occurring in our state, political polarization. So we've seen it first. And at the end of all of this dramatic and terrifying demographic change, we've got Korean taco trucks, and we're pretty proud.
So I'm going to give Mickey a chance to respond to this, and then I want to move on to talking about where we're going to go in terms of policy.
Well, I thought the summary of Professor Borjas' views was very accurate, except I think he has a higher number now. In his latest book, the range went up to 10%. I'm not saying that technological change and trade do not also depress wages. There are three forces all conspiring to depress wages of unskilled workers. We outsource jobs abroad, so unskilled work is performed abroad. Robots are replacing unskilled work. And when that doesn't happen, capitalists bring in immigrants to do the work that's left. Immigration is probably the least important of those, but it's the one we can correct fastest. So if you could get a quick 10% increase in the wages of the unskilled, that would be a huge achievement. The other thing is the effect gets worse the lower down the income scale you go. So by the time, for regular unskilled workers, maybe it's 5%. By the time you get to unemployed African-American teenage high school dropouts in depressed areas, it's a lot more than 10%. Those people are really hurt by unskilled immigration.
Manuel, you want?
Well, just so we're on the same data point, 10% is Borjas' old estimate. It was then, without getting too nerdy, it was done in what's called a partial equilibrium model, in which you interject immigrants but don't count for any of the addition that they make to the economy. So he's worked with some other folks, including Gordon Hanson from UC San Diego, to account for the sort of, when you think about it, immigrants have both complementary effects and substitution effects. They can either grow an economy, and then there's competitive effects within. So once you account for the growing effects, the drag on the lowest skilled workers is 3%, just so we're on the same data.
Since his book came out?
Yeah.
Oh.
I don't know that So are you
I don't
now
wanna get too
convinced?
nerdy.
Have you
No, I've communicated with him, and he seems still pretty gung-ho on immigrants lowering wages. So, when the draft of his recent book, which is only 6 months old, came out, everybody said, you have to have a number. You have to go to public with a number. People need to say it's 10% or it's 5%. And he settled on a range, which I think was 3 to 10%. Now, maybe he's revised it. I don't know.
Yeah, 3 to 10% is a pretty broad range. But anyway, I think the big issue is that what was driving the election was a combination of three things, I think. One is anxiety about the demographic change in the country. Two, economic uncertainty, which Mickey is pointing to. And I think it's interesting that in the election, the two candidates that took off the most were Donald Trump, speaking to the economic uncertainty and anxiety of one generation, and Bernie Sanders speaking to the economic anxiety of another generation. So clearly that was bubbling up. And then, of course, the third thing is that we've become a society in which people profit from political polarization, where it's become a business on both sides to try to polarize people rather than to try to lead. I mean, if you hearken back to, I never would have thought I would be worshiping George W. Bush. But if you thought about the way that Bush responded to 9/11 by within a week going to a mosque to try to reduce the fears of Islam and create a kind of more unified front against what he saw as terrorism, that's a different kind of leadership than we've been seeing recently.
Bob, can I just make a
certainly
macro point that
listen, this is a conversation.
touches at
I don't have
everything
to
that
go
we've
down a
all
list of
said,
questions.
because Manuel just mentioned Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. I think that's something that wasn't talked about enough but was very real, and it's been played out over again. It didn't strike me until the lead up to the French election, and I looked at the results in the polling, and I saw that Emmanuel Macron and Marine Le Pen were going to get to the second round, and I thought, holy crap, these are the two people completely outside the political establishment. And going back to the point about Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders, those were the two people who were also most outside the political establishment. And I think what's at work here in all Western countries in particular right now is that we are in an anti-establishment moment, and we have seen this played out in European countries where the establishment candidates are underperforming and the outsiders are overperforming. And I think the reason for that is for the working people who, are often in play in these elections. They believe they're being let down by every establishment institution, whether we're talking about the education system for their kids, a healthcare system that they feel isn't working, a job market that's creating uncertainty for them. I think we are in an anti-establishment moment, and Donald Trump was more than anything a completely bomb-throwing anti-establishment player in an anti-establishment moment.
I want to talk about where we go from here, because I think we could debate endlessly what happened in 2016 and the impact of immigrants. But right now we're seeing a wave of ICE roundups. We're seeing states like California fighting back with policies like sanctuary cities. What's the likely outcome here? Can immigrant rights be vindicated against a hostile administration? Emmanuel, I'll start with you.
It's going to be a challenge as we go forward. I wanted to contextualize this a little bit, and it kind of came out in the last panel, too. I mean, one important thing to realize is that the era of mass illegal immigration is over. The number of undocumented immigrants peaked in 2007, went down in around 2009 to about 11 million, has kind of been steadily dribbling downward since, partly because of a fact that was mentioned in the last panel, that currently, partly because of changed fertility rates, partly because of changed labor markets, there's more Mexicans going back to Mexico than are coming to the United States. I always say that what that means is that if we build a wall, we're just penning Mexicans in, which I'm sure was not the intention. But in that context, what's interesting is the following thing. In California, for example, we have undocumented immigrants, somewhere between 60% and 2/3 have actually been in the country for longer than 10 years. Somewhere between 15 and 20% of children in the state of California have at least one undocumented parent. There's as many family members who are U.S. citizens living in the same household as undocumented people as there are undocumented people in the state of California. So this is a population that is now long settled, deeply integrated really into the fabric of California. And what that means is the following thing with the deportations. Maybe 15, 20 years ago, if you grabbed somebody and deported them, you would be likely to pick up someone who had just gotten to the country, pretty light ties to the community, not necessarily family. Now, every time you reach in and deport someone, you're much more likely to be disrupting a family, disrupting a business, causing damage to a community. And that explains part of the reason why California has reacted so vociferously to the step up in ICE rates. Is because there's a sense in the state of wanting to protect these sort of long-term residents who are seen as contributors and part of the community and not as criminals in the same way that the administration seems to see them at. I think that the other thing that's going on here, which does in some sense bode well for immigrants in the state of California, is Jerry Brown. And that is that Jerry Brown is just cantankerous, right? So he doesn't really like the fact that Trump is challenging him on climate change, challenging him on everything else, including immigration. And we've got a cantankerous governor who's quite willing to fight back and was quite willing to bring Javier Becerra from Congress to become the Attorney General. And it's going to be a pretty vigorous defense. How this plays out is going to be very interesting. Because it does sort of raise a sort of issue of the new federalism, whether states can really go in very different directions. They can't on immigration policy, but California isn't trying to control the flow. They're trying to control what happens with populations that are already deeply settled.
Yeah, I'd like to go to Ali on this, and then we'll come to Mickey. One of the things that I think was interesting, by the way, in the omnibus bill that the president signed last week, $1.3 trillion in spending through September, is that it contains several things that the administration certainly did not want. One is more visas to increase immigration, actually. And the other is they did not have in that omnibus bill the provisions that would have allowed the federal government to withdraw federal aid for various programs from states that were sanctuary cities. Ali?
I think that the omnibus bill that was landed last week that Bob mentioned was just an incredible lost opportunity for the administration. Trump went into this wanting to include a bill of love for dreamers and wanting $25 billion for a wall. He and his staff consistently overreached over the course of the last few months to ask for massive cuts to legal immigration, dramatic increases to interior and immigration enforcement. And as a result, he went from having two birds in hand in terms of his beautiful wall and a bill of love for dreamers to having really nothing. And in fact, like you said, there are many things in there that he didn't want at all. How does this all play out over the next, let's just say, 6 to 10 months? I think the first line of defense has really been the courts, whether it's what's happening in California or on the East Coast. Those are both two good lines of cases with regards to the California Values Act, the Muslim ban cases, et cetera. What's happening in Texas around SB 4, and really that state's version, Texas's version of is much more troublesome. I think that, so you've got a judicial process, or litigation process. I think that the way this plays out in the elections will be really interesting. The one upside of this administration when it comes to immigration is that more Americans than ever are paying attention, and they're asking questions and they want more information. And we're talking people from the left to the middle to the right who are starved for information that they trust and that they can then inform their own personal decisions. So I think that to me is really a clear sign of hope. And then a lot of these House districts are Republicans who are representing districts that are increasingly diverse, increasingly well-off economically, and who are just asking questions of, I voted for Donald Trump in 2016, but he is taking our nation in a direction on immigration that is not what I expected. And I think that's another interesting factor of the next 10 months. And, finally, I think the issue that the administration will use will be sanctuary cities. They are going to drive that as their way to get base voters to the polls. It did not work in Virginia with Ed Gillespie. They also tried it in Pennsylvania in the closing days of the Pennsylvania race a couple of weeks ago. I think that the role of law enforcement officials speaking to the policy needs behind safe cities, not sanctuary cities, is the way to, again, provide the American public the information that they need from a trusted set of messengers of, okay, what is a safe city? It's not a sanctuary city, but it is a city where every cop on the corner can do their job and serve and protect every immigrant in their community. And that means that cop is not immigration enforcement.
Mickey, I suspect you dissent from some of this.
Yes, I like the wall. The wall doesn't deport anybody. It avoids the dilemma of having to deport people. As some of the immigrant groups realized later in the debate, they actually don't have such a problem with the wall. That's one of the reasons the Democrats caved on the wall at the end. They did not cave on ICE enforcement. They did not cave on E-Verify. They did cave on the wall.
How did they cave on the wall?
Schumer made Trump an offer. I'll give you the wall for Dreamers.
For Dreamers and a pathway to citizenship.
Yeah, but I mean,
it was the whole.
Previously, it's we'll never give you the wall. Now it's we'll give you the wall. That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah,
And that was a lost opportunity for the administration.
Well, I think it was since I think a straight trade of wall for Dreamers is a bad deal. I'm glad it fell through. I think it was a lost opportunity for Democrats. A Dreamer amnesty may be fine in itself. I have no beef with the Dreamers, but it's a huge incentive for future illegal immigration. You say if you come to America with your kids will probably become citizens. What kind of incentive is that to parents? It's a huge incentive. So you have to deal with the downstream effects of that encouraging future illegal immigration by a whole bunch of things, and wall is only part of it. You also need this E-Verify system to check. You also need some system of checking on visas. Anyway, yes, immigration has gone down, but it's shifted from Mexico to Central America, and there's troubling signs that it's going to surge in the next year. So there's stories just in the paper the last few days about it with the hot economy, people realizing that Trump is a paper tiger. The Border Patrol is expecting, I heard the figure 700,000, which would be a big jump. So the Trump effect is wearing off, and this news that, the problem is over, who cares, might change.
Okay, I want to get to a couple other things in this, and then to a political question before I open it up to the audience, and I'll start with Joel. And the question is really for all of you, so we'll just come straight down. Do you foresee any solution passing Congress and being signed into law anytime soon on DACA and on immigration reform in general?
What do you mean by anytime soon?
You can pick your time frame. Your lifetime's longer than mine.
I don't think anytime soon. I think it'll take a set of facts, a confluence of facts or circumstances. So I think if Republicans continue to see in the midterms, and I think this will be one of the challenges where Democrats have to do a better job. We now have millennials have passed senior citizens as a bigger voting bloc for the first time. That's only going to grow more pronounced as we go forward. We've seen in Alabama, we saw in Pennsylvania, the ability to win in suburban districts, where I do think that some of the hyper vitriolic language against people who don't look like us is going to bother some suburban voters, including college-educated women who we underperformed with in the presidential election. So I think the only way we'll see movement on this, I think, is if we see a couple of cycles in a row where Democrats get it right and win in those kinds of districts where Republicans are going to be more vulnerable, and where I still believe, despite Mickey's disagreement with me, that Republicans are on the wrong side of a lot of issues right now for those voting blocks in suburban districts with voters under the age of 40 that is going to create permanent damage if they don't get right on them. And whether that's guns, climate change, immigration, and diversity, if we can exploit those in a couple of electoral cycles, particularly 18 and 20, I think that would be a massive wake-up call, and you could see it possibly if there's some political shakeup through 2020.
Manuel?
So I just want to say again, to make sure that we are on a data point, is that the era of mass illegal immigration is over. That is, there's still some flow across the border, but border security is heightened considerably. Many of the biggest companies are already using E-Verify or some way of checking. We have a situation now where over half of the people who are coming recently or undocumented are actually coming on tourist visas and overstaying. There's very little that a wall is going to do to really deal with any of these issues. And so kind of getting on the same, I mean, this is a debate that's so full of emotion and feeling that kind of getting on the same fact base is really important. Am I optimistic about any legislation passing in the near future? Again, it depends on near and future, but basic answer is no. I think Ali may be a little bit more optimistic, so I'll pass the baton pretty quickly. But I think it's going to take basically the millennial voters coming on board who have very different feelings about this. I think it's going to take 2020 and the census and redistricting after that so that we don't have a situation where we currently have, which is Republicans getting slightly under a majority in the congressional elections, but still getting 55 to 60% of the seats because of the way the lines were drawn in 2010 or after 2010 in the Tea Party wave. If there's a Democratic or blue wave or even just reasonable performance in 2020, you're going to get a very different set of district lines drawn. You could have many more different voters. Here's a really interesting statistic for you. Can you tell I like statistics? Each year, 300,000 Latin American immigrants naturalize, and people pay a lot of attention to that. Each year, 1 million Latinos turn 18 who are U.S. citizens. And they happen to be related to a lot of these people who are being targeted right now, and they are going to show up at the polls. To me, I mean, I would be, you know, I remember in 2013 when the Senate proposed a bill that passed with about 2/3 of the senators and then went to the House of Representatives where all good things go to die, which is where it did die. And since I've been telling a lot of my Republican friends, you should have wished you passed that because that was the stingiest comprehensive immigration reform you can imagine, including the fact that it actually set aside $45 billion for border security. That's 2 walls that you could have, right? Because it knew that it was going to add so much by bringing workers in to the legal system, to Social Security and the coffers of the federal government. So I think if people who are more conservative or moderate on these issues want to have a comprehensive immigration reform that is more suited to their tastes, they'd better get busy. Because after 2020, 2022, the design of that will be that of a newer generation, of probably a more liberal Congress, and it won't have the onerous paths to citizenship that were put in place in 2013, probably won't have as much money set aside for border security as was in 2013.
So on the electoral piece, I think it's important that we understand that it's not going to be one cycle. It's going to be multiple cycles. And I think that, you know, the example of California since Prop 187 is a really something that's just something that's very important to reflect upon, because we didn't go in California go from Prop 187 to, you know, the California Values Act in a year or a cycle. It took a lot of hard work and quite a number of elections. And this is my opportunity to pitch Manuel's book coming out in April. He did nice enough to do it for me. So, but it's an opportunity, again, to kind of take a look back and understand what California's journey means for the future, not just of the state, but of the country. State of Resistance, it's called. It comes out
April 3rd.
April 3rd. The second thing, just in
Does it have a blurb from Mickey?
I think Manuel's still waiting.
Essential reading by any concerned citizen.
Exactly. It's about to be made into a major motion picture, too, in which I'll be portrayed by Antonio Banderas, so I'm quite excited.
And then from a policy perspective, I would agree that our next, assuming the politics and elections move in the right direction, it's really 2021 or beyond. But come next spring, there will be a flashpoint, and that flashpoint will be twofold. One is we're going to see about 250 to 300,000 individuals who are recipients of temporary protected status, by and large from Central American countries and Haiti, who will be losing that status. The majority of these people have been in the U.S. for over 15 years. They make up a huge percentage of those in the restaurant and the construction industry, particularly in a place like Texas. Once that status is, so there will be a legislative effort to, in essence, regularize their status. Somewhere around the same time, we could also see another attempt by the administration to end the DACA program, because by then the current case will have moved through the courts. It's important to realize that the question in front of the courts now is not whether or not the administration can end the program. The question in front of the courts is through which process can the administration end the program. So that's going to come to a close sometime late 2018, and again, we'll I think see an opening for or a flashpoint that may drive a legislative strategy in the first or second quarter of 2019.
A couple of quick points. The 2013 bill was a monstrosity. It was the $45 billion for border security was a complete fake that everybody expected to be taken out of the bill by the time it passed. It doubled legal immigration. It may be that it's a better bill than we're going to get in the future, because I agree that the long-term trends are not favorable to my side, but it was a terrible bill. If we control visas, people overstaying their visas, which I hope we do, that is about half the problem now. More people are going to try to cross by land, so we'll need the wall more. So it's a dynamic situation. You can't just say, well, people are coming in visas, so we don't need the wall. It'd be great if the problem has gone away because of added enforcement. It's been clear to people on the left as well as the right that the easy solution is to do the enforcement first, and then we can have an amnesty, and then the problem is solved. The pro-amnesty people would have had their amnesty decades ago if they'd followed this strategy. Instead, they try to do this where they do them both at once, and my side is distrustful of them because the last time we tried it, the amnesty stuck and the enforcement got undermined, and so we didn't get the enforcement. I do think there will be another attempt by Trump to do his DACA for Dreamers deal. He really wants to help the Dreamers. I wish he didn't. Somebody has gotten to him, either his friend Tom Barrack or his son-in-law Jared. He wants to help the Dreamers, and he wants his wall. So he's going to try again. And it may be when the court decisions come down. So that's going to be something to watch. It's sooner than this long-term trend.
Yeah, I'm not sure how much he wants to help the Dreamers, because he could have left the executive order in place. But I think he wants them as a bargaining chip for the wall. But I'd like to open this up because we're going to have to stop in about 10 minutes, and I'd like people to be able to ask their questions. So anybody has a question, raise your hand, and somebody get him a microphone.
Thanks. So Prop 187 was mentioned, and that was, I would say, kind of the door that opened Republicans to political oblivion in California. So when you look forward, whether it's 5, 10, or even a generational length forward, what do folks on the panel think the long-term implications of kind of this American-level Prop 187 moment are for the Republican Party?
So, I mean, the parallel's kind of closer than people think. And again, all very well covered in this wonderful book Ali was talking about, State of Resistance. Because not only was in California in 1994 the anxiety about undocumented immigrants that led to Prop 187, which essentially sought to strip undocumented immigrants of any access to non-emergency services, including education for children. But what people forget was that the slip in our manufacturing base between 1990 and 1994 was exactly the slip in the manufacturing base in Michigan between 2007 and 2011, and that Rush Limbaugh began his talk radio career in Sacramento in the 80s, sort of fanning the flames of this along with talk radio in LA. And it took quite a long time before the sort of combination of immigrant mobilization and I would say ally distaste for what the Republicans were doing took hold. But as you know, in the state of California now, there's not a single statewide Republican office holder, and there are supermajorities in both the state assembly and the state senate. And the just now retiring President pro tem of the state senate, Kevin De Leon, cut his teeth as an immigrant rights organizer, organizing against Prop 187. So it's kind of a sort of a full circle. If you go forward, that doesn't bode well for the Republican Party. But remember that we're talking about a lot of different states in the United States. So whether or not that dynamic plays out in Alabama is, except for Doug Jones, who had the good luck to draw Roy Moore as his opponent, whether it plays out that way in certain places that are Republican strongholds, not very clear. But can Arizona move? Yes. Can Nevada move pretty permanently? Yes. Can Texas move over the course of 15 to 20 years? Yes. So I think there's a lot to be learned and a lot to be worried about. I mean, I do think that one of the reasons why George W. Bush was so enthusiastic about comprehensive immigration reform was both his own experience as a Texas governor and his familiarity with the population, but also with his sense that this would be something key to the future of a more diverse Republican Party.
And I just want to underscore what Manuel said there is that, and I put it this way, is that California is not the rest of the country. And so that's why I think that those suburban districts with large numbers of college-educated men and women are really interesting places to watch in the near term. But when you go through the Southeast and up through the Midwest, those states are not going to disappear. I mean, they're going to continue to play a very large role in our political discussion. So I'm worried that those of us who care about this issue, we think that the rest of the country will become California, and that's just not the case. So we've got to figure out how we are making the case to folks who are Republicans now are going to be Republicans for generations, and give them ways to engage in this issue in a constructive way.
Another question?
Thank you. I'm a legal immigrant for almost 40 years down here. Question is now whether we give to DACA or any amnesty to any illegal people, can we just, both the party can think about it not to issue the citizenship? Because the balance of powers, when you mention Manuel, all the numbers in the future generation, definitely it will be worrisome.
Are you saying people are resisting giving citizenship because they're worried about its political impact? Yeah.
So I've never thought that the question is whether or not the undocumented should be allowed a path to citizenship. I mean, the political question. And I think that's borne itself out in the last 6 months. Trump was willing to give citizenship to 1.8 million undocumented immigrants. And even when you look at the polling of Republicans and conservatives, there's always strong support for citizenship for the undocumented because people want their immigrant neighbors to own the American dream, not to rent the American dream. The question, I think, has always been what's the future flow of immigration to the country? And that's the anxiety that our opponents continue to push on, is that the person who's here, okay, that's fine. Let's allow them to become citizens, but let's not let in anybody afterwards. That, I think, continues to be the much more difficult question for us to grapple with.
Republicans every now and then say, okay, we'll try to sneak an amnesty through by not giving citizenship, and that almost never flies because Americans want their neighbors to be citizens. They don't want a second-class group of people. So I just don't think that buys very much.
Another question?
I want to agree with Mickey on what he just said, by the way, since we've disagreed on everything. I think he's hit the nail on the head. Yeah. I mean, Americans and Republicans will recognize that. I mean, then it's a question of negotiating around that. But that's true. People want and understand, look, I'm a grandson of immigrants, right? How many people here are either a child or a grandchild of immigrants? Look at that, okay? It's at least half the room, if not more. So you understand what the immigrant experience is. You want those people to become Americans. That's what your goal is.
Yeah, I don't think I think we probably have rare agreement on this panel on this. I don't think creating a situation in which people could legally stay here but not be citizens, that is apartheid in America, makes a lot of sense, and I don't think it would get much support. We have another question. Somebody got the mic?
Hi, thank you very much. I would like to bring back the attention of the panel to the topic of refugees, since you titled the panel.
I just didn't get to it, but because of time, but so I'm glad you're asking.
No, thank you, sorry. So specifically, I'm interested, you've been talking about perceptions and anxieties, and I think there's still a prevalent perception of refugees as vulnerable. I would like the panel to address the fact of the economic contributions of refugees to the U.S. and how that is also needs to be more discussed. I know Manuel might be able to talk about it, but if I could hear from the rest of the panel on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just the contributions, it's also the resistance to refugees. Manuel, do you want to start?
Well, I will just say that I think that a lot of times that issue does get sort of minimized in the California context in particular, but in the United States generally, and Ali can actually speak, I think, more to the refugee situation than I. And it's partly because there's so many immigrants relative to refugees that the issue gets put to one side. We see significant economic progress of refugees over time. There's been increasing interest in some of our Midwestern cities about attracting refugees because they see them as entrepreneurial and able to contribute to revitalization. There has certainly been a heightened fear given the rise in international terror about refugees and the concerns that they're associated with that. This is probably the most heavily vetted group of immigrants or of migrants that come into the country of any group. And so those fears seem pretty misplaced, but they're definitely there. Now, I know that, Ali, you do a lot of work in communities that are actually significant recipients of refugee flows where there's been some cultural anxieties and disruptions, and I know you've worked with those folks.
So one example is in Idaho. Idaho itself has the third largest dairy industry in the country, and when you look at southern Idaho, where most of that industry is located, their unemployment rate is 3, maybe 4%. So it's a very, very, very tight labor market that depends by and large now on Latino immigrants and refugees. Just after the election, just like in other parts of the country, there's a big backlash against refugees in Idaho, in southern Idaho. And it was interesting to see because it was the conservative dairy farmer and the faith community in Idaho that led the charge in terms of making the case about the economic and the social contributions of refugees to a very, very, very conservative state like Idaho. The other piece I would highlight in terms of the refugee debate is the cultural resonance of refugees among conservative faith communities, whether it's the LDS community, the evangelical community, the Catholic community, in really quite conservative parts of the country where they, frankly, come to the immigration debate through a refugee lens. And the experience that congregations have in resettling refugees either within their particular communities, regardless of religion, or individuals going overseas and helping refugees in the Middle East. And we found that it's that experience and that values framework that has led to just a really interesting way that the refugee debate will unfold in conservative parts of the country.
Okay, we're coming near the end here, and I'm going to let Mickey say something, either on the refugee question, the so-called Muslim ban, or whatever else you want, and then Joel, I'll give you a final word.
Well, on the refugee question, I thought the demonstrations after Trump's travel ban had a real effect of reminding even conservatives that Americans see themselves as a welcoming nation, and you don't really want to screw around with that. It seems to me we're approaching a resolution, which is Obama's number was approaching 100,000. Trump cut it down to 40 or 50. and people are sort of willing to live with that. It's a tiny symbolic fraction of the world's refugees anyway. My basic point is there's all this ideology of globalism and openism. Open versus closed is the new fashion, and the future is free immigration, free trade, subordination to global governing institutions. And my point is just we don't have to. Why do we have to do this? We don't have to march to an open global future if it leads to a society stratified by merit where unskilled Americans are thrown into the dustbin. We don't have to do it if we don't want to.
Joel, you have a final word?
Sure. I mentioned I'm the grandchild of immigrants, and by the way, so is Donald Trump. And both of us have grandparents who came to this country a little over a century ago, not speaking a word of English, who came to this country and set out for these shores because they thought that this was the land of hope and opportunity, a place where people, if you work hard, if you play by the rules, and you do right, you can have a better future, you can get ahead, you can build a future for your family. Now, we didn't always live up to those ideals in this country. I'll be the first one to say that. But we've done a better job than most of the places on this earth. And I also know that rooted in our founding documents is a belief that all people are created equal. And we haven't lived up to that always, but it's in our founding documents. As well as we, the people, are charged with creating a more perfect union. It's not our Constitution. It's we, the people. And for more than 2 centuries, people have seen America as a beacon of hope in a troubled world, and they have set out for these shores. And make no mistake, we are today, and we always have been, a nation of immigrants, and we ought to embrace it and not fear it and not demonize it. It's what has helped us every step of the way become the power we are. Thank you.
On that note, I will conclude by thanking Joel, Mickey, Manuel, and Ali, and announcing that we have about a 5 or 6 minute break, and then we're going to have lunch, and we're going to hear from President Nikias. Thank you all very, very much.
Yeah.
Okay, I can get it on Amazon?
Yeah.
Okay.